Hello, everyone, and welcome to your Daily Detroit, sharing what to know and where to go in Southeast Michigan. It is a wet Wednesday, June 18th, 2025. I'm Jer Stays, coming to you from our studio at Techtown in the Paris of the Midwest, Detroit, Michigan. Joining me, as he has in the past on the show, to talk about recent developments in media and the news about the news, none other than Matt Friedman, partner, Tanner-Friedman, Public Relations, and overall, I would say, good guy. So welcome back. Good to see you.
Thank you, Jer. I appreciate that endorsement and the return visit here. It's great to be back.
When it comes to public relations, as a reporter, I'm always like, but you're the kind of person who tells it how it is. And I really appreciate that about you.
I believe that this business should be nonfiction. So I try to write and speak nonfiction all day long.
Well, let's talk about nonfiction. And the nonfiction news is the joint operating agreement between the Detroit Free Press and the Detroit News is coming apart after 36 years, I believe.
Yeah.
Which is wild.
That was the 80s, late 80s when that was all popping.
Yeah.
And the world has changed since then.
Let's set the table with what exactly is a joint operating agreement between two papers that ostensibly you look on the label and these should be rivals. These are different brands, etc. But they had separate editorial, separate newsrooms, but joint business operations, correct?
Correct. And there used to be laws against this in this country. And what started happening in the 80s when media started changing and the real glory and gravy days of the media business were ending is that media organizations were trying to find new models. And so the Detroit News and the Detroit Free Press both agreed that in order for both to survive, they needed to combine their business operations. And in order to do that, they had to go to court and all the way to the Supreme Court for that to be allowed. And I think what's happened since then is they have both survived, but it's created a lot of confusion in the marketplace. Clients ask me all the time, what's the difference between the two? Why do we have two newspapers? Younger clients will say, we still have newspapers? So there's some of that. And we've seen a lot of that in subsequent years in radio and TV. The caps have been listed on radio stations. So it used to be at the time that the JOA formed for the newspapers, a company could only own one AM and one FM station in a market, far more than that now. Even TV stations, you have Scripps here in Detroit that owns Channel 7 and Channel 20, and they operate them out of the same building. CBS owns Channel 50 and Channel 62. Now, if you're over a certain age, you know what those numbers mean. If you're below a certain age, you don't know what the numbers mean, but you know where to find them if there's something you want to watch.
I am of the age where I still had to be my dad's remote control. Yeah. So I'm familiar with what those numbers mean and turning the knob and the click, click, click on the TV.
So that's just an illustration of how much things have changed. That 36 years ago, this was about print newspapers delivered to your home. This was about stations watched over the air on TV and radio stations you listen to on a portable radio or in the car. And all that has converged and all that has changed. And we've reached a point now where the Detroit News and the Detroit Free Press and their corporate owners, very important, both of these local news organizations are owned by companies based out of town. They've decided to go their separate ways from a business standpoint. And so now they will not only compete editorially, in other words, compete for news stories, and try to get first and try to break a story to their audience, but they're going to compete from a business standpoint also. And that's something we haven't seen in generations in this market. And the big question is, how's that going to work and what's going to happen?
So listeners believe it's Gannett and Alden Global Capital are the two owners?
Gannett owns the Free Press. They're the largest owner of local news organizations around the country. They're best known for USA Today, which you used to be able to get on every street corner in the country and every hotel room threshold in the country. It was really geared for travelers and sports fans like me who used to love the box scores, but that was really their flagship product. And then, there's a company, basically a hedge fund. I don't know if that's the exact right word, but conversationally, that's what it is, that owns the Detroit News and incidentally owns the Oakland Press out of Oakland County, the Macomb Daily out of Macomb County, and what used to be the Royal Oak Daily Tribune. Those three brands are owned by the same group. And so what kind of combination they'll form now with the Detroit News, we don't yet know, but you'll already see Detroit News stories on the Oakland Press and Macomb Daily's websites and vice versa.
Yeah. Before we get into the specifics of this market, there are overall huge pressures on the newspaper business, not just, obviously print delivery is in decline. I think the newspapers wrapped up or are in the process of wrapping up. I can't remember their printing plant out in Sterling Heights. That's something that's only certain listeners of a certain age will be familiar with. But there's also pressures on the news website, the apps. This move from advertising to subscription. The whole industry has been under a lot of pressure, not just in Detroit, but nationally, correct?
Absolutely, yes. And yes, we used to say that they would, and then I say used to, I'm talking about 20 years ago, early 2000s, they'd make dollars from selling print ads and pennies from selling ads online. But the audience has said loud and clear that they like reading news online. I still enjoy the print newspaper. It was ridiculous for me to pay that kind of money for them to deliver it to my driveway once a week. Sometimes I'd kind of read it online before I even got downstairs. So the consumer prefers online. And the challenge is when all this started around 2000, they were giving away the online product for free. Thinking that maybe you'd get your news of the moment online, but when it came down to actually read something, you'd read the print edition, and you'd consume both. And the consumer has basically said, no, we want our news online, and they've had trouble making money that way. So then they abruptly stopped giving it away for free and started charging for some of it or all of it, and that's a tough transition for people who are used to reading it for free day after day after day, year after year. So that's the primary business challenge here is how the consumer wants it. It's also much more efficient rather than having a printing press and a printing plant to print a newspaper and figuring out how to get it to you through a logistics and distribution mechanism. And now you get it on your phone through an app. It's just easier.
Well, and that's part of the challenge too, though. When you're a business, when you lose control of your distribution, which is part of that wider thing that's happening with the increase of social media, all that kind of stuff. Controlling that distribution helps be a bottleneck, right? Like, because the only place you could do ads for a long time was your local paper or something. If you're trying to sell a car or something like that.
Classified advertising was really their bread and butter, and Craigslist obliterated that, and Facebook Marketplace has a piece of that action, and so does eBay. And so that's been diversified. So that was a big revenue source that went away, along with the display advertising, the ads that you would hold up the newspaper and see if you were eating breakfast at a Coney or you were sitting in your easy chair at home. As a reader, once upon a time, you'd see these ads and those had value and they pay top dollar. I remember 25 years ago hearing that a full-page ad in the Sunday combined edition of the News and Free Press was something like $30,000. That was a lot of money. They could employ a lot more journalists that way and provide profits to corporate shareholders that way, rather than, your subscription, whatever that is a month, which is what they have now. These newsrooms have shrunk considerably. I left the broadcast news business and got into PR in 1998. The News and the Free Press, probably between the two of them, had somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 to 400 journalists. And it's a tiny fraction of that now. It's not,
I heard an interview
with
the Detroit
now.
Yeah, I heard an interview with the publisher of the Detroit News. I think it was 83 employees at the Detroit News across the board.
And that's one of the bigger in the country. This is not a Detroit phenomenon. I have people who say to me over the years, the newspapers are so thin and it's just hard to get news in the newspapers, and the websites don't really have that much. It doesn't seem like they employ that many people. I guess that's just the sign of the times in Detroit. I said, no, we have almost an embarrassment of riches here with two viable news organizations. The question is, what's it going to take for them to remain viable? Nobody has the answer yet. I think the key, and I look at this from a narrow PR and marketing perspective, because that's where I've been living day in and day out now for almost 30 years, but I think there's no real brand differentiation between the Detroit Free Press and the Detroit News. I have clients, professional business people, often professional communicators, who get the two confused routinely or don't know the difference between the two. They shared a masthead on that combined edition for Sundays for decades. And so if they're going to survive as independent news operations, they need to distinguish themselves from one another. And other than opinion writing, where historically the Detroit News has been to the right and the Free Press has been to the left, and that does not necessarily permeate through the rest of the news organization. That's a common misunderstanding. Those they're going to somehow have to figure out how to develop brands on their own.
And the challenge is not only developing those brands, but developing brands. And this is a question that we sometimes wrestle with right here at Daily Detroit with the things that we do as a media property. what are the brands that are going to be something that people are willing to pay money for?
Yes.
And in this world of so many subscriptions, we have subscriptions to Cranes, Freep, News, 50 other things. It's expensive really fast. And but the thing is that the thing that makes the reporting go is the subscriptions, because I know how little digital ads play. And I know from talking to listeners about, they'll go on the website for these places, right? Or they'll get the app and they'll see ad after ad after ad after ad. And they're like, they must be doing fine. And in reality, they can pack all those ads and still not pay the bills, because that's how little advertising pays online on a website.
Yeah, it's very similar to streaming. So I have people say to me all the time, do I really have to pay for all these news sites? And my question to them is, are you getting value from it? Are you reading the articles? Are you feeling enriched? Very similar to streaming. Do you need Hulu and Apple Plus and HBO Max and Paramount Plus? Fill in the blanks. Do you need all of those? Well, if you watch them, you'll pay for them. And there's ads too, unless you pay a little bit more. Amazon Prime has ads now, and Hulu has ads. I think Netflix has ads, but I don't think we subscribe to that one. Anyway,
yeah,
it's easy to lose track. It's the same thing with news subscriptions. So they not only have to have brand differentiation like the streamers do, they have to provide value and connect with their audience. And the audience needs to understand what they're paying for and why, or sooner or later that monthly fee is going to get nixed from the credit card bill.
What are a couple of ways that they could differentiate from each other?
Well, that's been a struggle for the local TV stations for a long time, and is going to be even more of a struggle. I mean, everybody in media is trying to differentiate. One way we see it at the national level is through the political prism. And we know the difference between MSNBC and Fox News Channel. We know that. But that's really hard to do on a local level.
And I would also submit that your political audience is only a subset of what you do. When at least when I look at local coverage, so much of local coverage is not about the mayor's race, but it's about the best place that you need to go to, or that traffic thing happening on 96, or all the stuff
that's local news.
Yeah, to me, that's the bread and butter of it. I think political is just one section of it. And when I listen to listeners, they tell me they really value the stuff that connects them with their culture and their community.
So it makes me wonder, and this is pure speculation, if one of these news outlets will say, we're going to do more automotive, we're going to do more sports, we're going to cover state government more, we're going to cover city government more, we're going to claim the suburbs and cover maybe some local school boards and issues like that. There may be some product differentiation through some specialized reporting to create value from the audience. That's just one idea. But they are going to need to do something, because it's going to be hard to convince anybody other than the junkies like us to subscribe to more than one. And in fact, there's a relatively high barrier just to getting a subscription.
Well, and oftentimes the fact is, I don't mean to be like dour about it, but the fact is, oftentimes when these things break up, one doesn't make it. That's statistically the case.
That's what's happened since the 80s, since JOAs became a thing. What we didn't have in the 80s, and we didn't have until recently, is AI. And so that's another factor here, is will one or the other or both start substituting AI for reporting, and will the audience buy that? And, the way AI exists right now, the answer is no. The audience would not buy that.
They'll read it for free, but they won't buy it.
They won't. Yeah, they won't pay for that. But as AI continues, is that a threat to journalism, along with the economics and the delivery mechanisms and everything else we're talking about? That's another thing that I'm going to be keeping an eye on.
I'll be keeping an eye too on the user experience, which, this is where I believe an independent publication can sometimes have a little bit more flexibility than one part of a larger group, because the app experience is so important. And the reality is if you are a Gannett property, you're using kind of the same Gannett. If you load up the app for Gannett at different cities, it's all basically the same design, the same whatever. And that app experience, look, there is a huge difference between using the Freep or the News app, and I'm a New York Times subscriber. That app, it's like you're driving a Chevy Spark versus a Corvette as far as an app experience between the two of them. And the New York Times invested a lot in technology and in reporting that even goes to the app, where You open up the app on the New York Times, there's Jonathan Swan talking to you about the Iranian crisis in a format that you're used to on social media, but still is engaging, but you're engaging on their property.
Yeah. And keep in mind, when I talk about the Detroit News and the Detroit Free Press being independent, they're independent from each other starting in January. They're still part of these corporate entities based out of town, so there's only so much they can do. But I hope these entities are smart enough to know that if they're going to be in a competitive situation here in Detroit, at least at the beginning, that they're pretty much not in anywhere else, and they need to handle it accordingly, which means they need to invest in marketing and product differentiation.
With the overall change in consumption, you and I were talking about it off air, social media now overtakes television as far as news consumption. What does that mean is a whole nother question. But the fear being that there won't be in the investment. It'll be the kind of thing where it's like when somebody bought the Yellow Pages, right? They bought a Yellow Pages in some city and they got all the money out of it they could, but they didn't really invest in the next generation of the Yellow Pages, right? And I think that's the worry of some people, and especially those who are concerned about journalism, which both the Detroit News and the Free Press do excellent work on the journalism side.
They do. They routinely break stories. They routinely go deep on stories. I think it's valuable. I pay for both of them, and not just because I'm an avid news reader. I think it's worth paying for. And so I hope that that's able to continue. I mean, I would love it if we're sitting back here in a few years and talking about how great it is for Detroit and what a selling point it is for Detroit that we have competitive, historic legacy news outlets here. I hope they both make it. And they can overcome the odds to be able to do that. It's just in order to do that, they need to start acting like businesses independent from each other that they haven't had to do in a really long time.
And it might sound crazy to some, but I hope they do too. I really honestly do, because I know that it's all interdependent, right? It's all a web of content creation and different angles. And this town would be a lot worse off to lose either one of them, honestly. And I would love to see a resurgence with some of that. I wanted to ask you on a larger sense, that change, these changes in overall consumption, not only do they make the business propositions and the challenges bigger for these two papers, but I think overall in local media, I can even sense it. Like I always was able to sense it in the wind about what stories are interacting with people and what formats resonate with people. But now this new data that's out that you and I were sharing off air from the Reuters Institute, it's kind of like mind blowing. And I understand people have their preferences, and then I also have a lot of fears because social media and news, I understand it's really fun to consume, and it's really easy, and people resonate with it a lot. But also, like, I see so much stuff spread that's missing so much important information.
Headlines are driving so much. So when I have clients that ask me to complain about a story on their behalf, which is not very often, by the way, this is something I always like to disclaim when I have an opportunity. Journalists almost always get it right. But human beings are going to make mistakes from time to time. When the mistake is most egregious, it's in the headline. It's not in the reporting. And that's true now more than ever because headlines drive consumption. Headlines drive shares. And the social media user who is scrolling for news is usually only seeing headlines. And if that's your primary source of information, you're not getting the story. There's a reason there's a story that accompanies the headline, and that is because it requires more examination, depth, detail, facts, analysis. You don't get that from a headline. That's my biggest concern with social media consumption. The other thing, too, is that once upon a time when we were putting a newscast together, broadcasting like I used to do, or a newspaper like those great professionals have done, you'd put the stories you thought were important out there, and then you'd put a bunch of other things to try to balance it out. And you put the product out, and you weren't sure exactly what they were reading or skipping, and now we know.
Yes.
And it's been democratized. And the stories that get read the most are usually not the most important stories. They're often just the most interesting or shareable stories. Our friend Devin Scillian, the great TV anchor, now great media observer, likes to say that when he started in journalism, it was about taking important things and trying to make them interesting. Now they're trying to take interesting things and make them important. Those are Devin's words, not mine, but they think they're prophetic. And so, yeah, when you take a look at what people are actually consuming, it's often the least important stuff or the least accurate stuff with the best headlines. And that's what makes for social media content. And the barometer for success in social media is very different from what it is in news.
Yeah, and so are the finances.
Yes.
The finances are very different because it is very hard to do real reporting. You know, it's one thing to like stand in front of somebody else's article and offer like 2 hot takes. It's a different thing to spend all the hours and time to actually uncover that work. And that's where the money has to be spent. And that's kind of the challenge, because people will say, oh, well, there's this influencer I follow and they stand in front of the art. Everyone's seen it a million times. They stand in front of the text and like, these are the 3 things you need to know. Well, the thing is that they're summarizing that. There wasn't the comprehension of the hours or days of work of reporting to get that truly unique piece of content together.
To me, it's the best analogy, and it's imperfect, is fast food. On social media, you get fast food, and if you're paying for journalism, you get a real chef conceptualized and prepared and homegrown and carefully chefed and constructed meal. And fast food is really popular. It's cheaper and it tastes really good, and you don't have somebody telling you, just wait. So we see that in the journalism world too. And I hope there's a place for journalism. And a lot of people are surprised when, as a PR person, I say that, because we're supposed to be adversarial with the journalist, if you believe some people. But I like working with really good journalists because they get the stories right and they convey my client's message thoroughly so that it's understood. I'll work with the good journalist versus the flash and burn person anytime.
I do want to mention before we go the rise in news podcasts, up to 15%, and in fact rivaling news radio now as a way that people get information. And I've seen a lot of that response too, where people are searching out for this thing that really calls specifically to them. And the rise of podcasting in general, obviously there was all the impact of the election, but even since then, that idea of like that longer form conversation, you were just talking about, a lack of depth, but one of the great things about podcasting is the ability to have a lot of depth.
Yes. Your audience understands podcasting. You wouldn't be listening to us right now, especially this far in, if you didn't understand it. But one of the great things about podcasting that audiences really like is they can listen to it whenever they want. And one of the things that we did in the media business, Legacy, years ago is we said, we're going to deliver you the paper at this time every day. We're going to do the news on the radio at this time every hour. We're going to do the TV newscast at 5, 6, and 11. Please join us. And the podcast model is, here it is whenever you want. Mm-hmm. And audiences are responding really well to that, along with personality connection, depth of storytelling, and all the other things that they like about the podcast. So I think in many ways it's a healthy trend, but it depends on the podcast too.
We are in the middle of 2025. Let's leave with, next 6 months, looking to the end of the year. What is the biggest thing that you're looking forward to, or a prediction you might have for local media and things around Metro Detroit?
Well, I'll tell you what my concern is that the media business was headed into the year on a downward trend. So that's a concern. And there are a lot of reasons for that. There's no big elections this year. That's a factor. Consumer habits are changing. We talked about that. Layered on top of that are threats to the First Amendment by the federal government. So I'm concerned about the way things are going. I'm optimistic that good journalists will persevere in any way they are legally allowed to, but the trends we're seeing at the national level could affect us locally, and I think everybody needs to be ready for that. At the same time, my message to you, Jer, last year has not changed, which is if you value an information product, pay for it. That will really help. If nothing else, to pay the lawyers to fight off the federal government.
With that, I will say, if you'd like to support what we're doing, join us at patreon.com and help support local media, because local media needs you to survive and thrive. Thank you for the perfect segue. I had to take it. I'm sorry.
You did have to, and I'm glad you did.
All right, Matt Friedman, Tanner-Friedman. You can go to tannerfriedman.com, learn more. You do a lot of great writing, too. about the topic. And I think that's important too. You're always very timely with your thoughts. And that's why I'm always glad to have you around the studio. And of course, if people have feedback, dailydetroit@gmail.com. We'll gladly take questions. I have a feeling you'll come back if I invite you.
Anytime. Always happy to be here. This is a cool part of town, and I am old enough to have a kid who lives nearby, so I don't mind coming down here.
One of these days, we should talk to your kid about you.
She'd be happy to, I'm sure.
All right. Well, thank you so much for listening to Your Daily Detroit. I really appreciate you. Tomorrow, Norris Howard will be joining me. We are going to answer a question that many of you have sent in that I didn't realize I needed to answer. What is an UNC? For now, I'm Jer Stays. Thank you so much for listening. Remember that you are somebody, and we'll talk tomorrow.